Good evening. From our headquarters in Kiev, this is the Sunday Show, the only primetime TV program explaining the Eastern European geopolitical storm in English. I'm Andrei Kulikov, and tonight on the Sunday Show we will delve further into the repercussions of the Paris summit in Normandy format, but first we're going to talk about the Sheremet case. We have two distinguished panelists here. Tetiana Popova, she used to be Deputy Minister for Information Policy and remains one of the most outspoken and knowledgeable experts in the field. And Elena Loginova, she is a famous investigative journalist from Slidstvo.Info, which is one of the most authoritative investigation outlets in Ukrainian journalism. I remind you that Pavel Sheremet was a famous Ukrainian journalist murdered in 2016, and the matter of the investigation into his death for all this time remained a question of contention among Ukrainian journalists, among everyone who wants the rule of law in this country. And then suddenly we have suspects, we have Minister of Interior making loud statements, but first I would like our guests to try within a minute each to formulate the importance of the matter. Tetiana Popova starts.
Thank you, Andrei. Actually, I left the government after killing of Sheremet because my minister told me that now we cannot do anything about helping and protecting journalists in 2016. And from my point of view, that was one of the reasons why Poroshenko later failed, because a lot of journalists, first of all, started to mistrust in his government and his methods of working and supporting journalists. We know that after Slidstvo.Info Panama leaks, Poroshenko was very disappointed and I would even say more angry, and the campaign against journalists and journalist investigators started. So trying to find who is made this bombing and who is behind ordering this bombing is important for journalist society, of course, for democracy in Ukraine.
Tetiana Popova, Elena Loginova.
Thank you, Andrei. The Sheremet case, it's a very important case. It's one of the main cases on which we are working during all these 3 and almost half years. Because you cannot go and sleep every day without knowing who could order such crime. And when we suddenly have 3 suspects with so loud presentation, but without big proofs, it makes us really worrying. We see this like very dangerous signal for the whole system. And now, because it's not easy for journalists, even for official law investigators, to find even people who planted the bomb. I'm not talking about the people who ordered this, but now we have other duty. We need to control every step of official investigators because there is no trust in them. That's what we are trying to do now.
From what our guest said, I single out 2 points. From Tetiana Popova's statement, the matter that the case of Sheremet was probably instrumental in annulling the chances of Mr. Poroshenko to be re-elected, but not annulling the chances of the Minister of Interior to assume his position again in the new government. And from what Elena Loginova said, recognizing a lot of work that Slidstvo.Info did in this respect, I must say that, of course, it's very question. She pays attention primarily to who commissioned the crime. And by the way, this is what Sevgil Musayeva pays attention to when interviewed by the Hromadske, this lady who is the editor-in-chief of Ukrainska Pravda, where Pavel Sheremet used to work. She said that without answering the question who was the paymaster, we cannot safely talk about the crime being resolved.
I am most worried by the lack of answers to obvious questions, the motive of the paymasters, the assassins, who the paymaster is, and how objective grounds are for the version that was voiced as the main one yesterday, that it was done to destabilize the situation in the country. Because in reality, the destabilization that was announced in the report of the investigative group did not happen. I have doubts regarding the named suspects because the story that a group of volunteers could have organized the murder of a famous journalist in order to destabilize the situation in the country without a paymaster. This seems unlikely to me. Concerning Andrei Antonenko and Yulia Kuzmenko, who are the key suspects in the case and who are identified as those who had planted the explosive, they are absolutely public people. They never hid from the pre-trial investigators. They lived in the spotlight, including the Hryshenko couple, who were detained earlier in a different case. Yulia Kuzmenko was present at the court hearings. She came to support. It's odd behavior for someone who is involved in such a high-profile murder, and for someone who is aware that the investigation is still ongoing. We are cautious about the revelations. Anything is possible now. Yesterday, after we published our blog that states our position on Facebook, I started to receive messages from people who knew Yulia Kuzmenko from work, from Andrei Riffmaster Antonenko's acquaintances who are his fans, that these people definitely had nothing to do with this crime. But at the same time, we might sometimes not understand people's motives. We might not know of their other life. There is public image that is conveyed through social networks too. Regarding me, I can say that I was questioned a long time ago, in 2017. I have one expectation because yesterday, after the briefing on the air of one TV channel, Minister Avakov said that only 6 to 7% of information has been released. I surmise and hope that the investigation has progressed a lot. When we published our statement on July the 20th, we said that we think the law enforcement leadership should resign. After that, Serhiy Knyazev resigned, Yuri Lutsenko resigned, but Minister Avakov is indispensable. He has started his second term under Zelenskyy. It's political luck and the fact that he can remain in his position. I wouldn't want this case to be utilized in order to receive political dividends.
In 2 or 3 minutes, we'll show you a video file presenting the cases of those most unusual suspects. But so far, my question is again to our guests, Elena Loginova and Tetiana Popova. From what you know about those people, how likely it is that they acted on their own, presumed that they acted at all? Elena.
In our work, we try to rely on facts. I mean facts like some data which you can analyze and then make some conclusions. For example, it can be a number of plate license of the car, and then we can find some witness, talk with them. I cannot rely on just some conversations and make some conclusions. From what we have seen from this briefing, it's just emotional pictures. So I cannot say that people who are doing good things for our country, who are volunteer just based on their psychological portrait, I cannot make some decisions. But what we have seen, like presented proofs, for me, it's not proofs enough to say that people are guilty.
Elena, briefly, in Ukraine, quite often journalists do what the investigative bodies should do. Is Slidstvo.Info going to continue its investigation into this case?
We never stopped it.
All right,
It's
thank
just
you.
because we didn't have some relevant information, that's why we don't publish it. If I just want to add that when officials came and say, we analyzed thousands of video, we interrogated hundreds of people, we don't say how many work we do, because the main is the result. I hope that they have much more that they showed us, but from what they showed us, it's nothing.
Thank you. Tetiana Popova, you paid attention in your today's publication in the Ukrainska yesterday's. Yeah, okay. I read it first thing in the morning, so for me it is still very fresh. That the the proclaimed aim of the crime to destabilize the situation in the country was not achieved. But is it possible, or was it possible at the moment, to further destabilize the situation at all?
I'm not sure it was only just destabilization in a country like creating Maidan. I think it was rather to spoil this crime bring spoiling of Ukraine image and image of the government abroad. Because if you remember what's going on after publishing of Panama Leaks by Slidstvo.Info, it was attacks on investigating journalists, then attacks on journalists who was working in occupied territories after MH17. So it was like several steps, several mistakes made by previous government, which allowed Russians to say like, oh, Ukrainians, crazy Banderovцы, they are trying to attack journalists. And then killing of Sheremet was like one of the next steps which created this image to previous government.
So is the source of the crime outside Ukraine?
It's definitely not their personal idea to do that. It's either internal players or external who order this crime. And I think Avakov told that during their briefing. They told that they see it as ordered crimes. But they didn't say who orders it. That's, from my point, is a bit strange with this briefing. They should say much, or should investigate more and come to public with more information.
I personally think that the strangest thing about all this is the publicity that is being given the case at the moment, when we still have too many questions to answer. And one of the questions is how such people, as we know them, came to commit such crime, if they did it. Let's watch a video which sort of introduces you to the suspects.
Andriy Antonenko, better known as Reefmaster, military volunteer Yulia Kuzmenko, and nurse Yana Duhar are all suspects in the July 2016 murder of Ukrainian journalist Pavel Sheremet. Here's what we know. Antonenko, or Reefmaster, is a Ukrainian musician and soldier, holding the rank of sergeant in the Ukrainian armed forces. From the start of the conflict in the Donbas, Reefmaster first helped the Ukrainian forces in the war zone as a volunteer and then joined the special forces. His song Quietly Came, Quietly Left is nearly a hymn for the service of the Ukrainian special forces. Antonenko says that he is not aware of why he is suspected of Sheremet's murder and doesn't recall what he was doing on July 20, 2016, when Sheremet's car was blown up in central Kiev.
I don't remember if I was in Kiev or not. It's very difficult to say. I don't even remember when it happened.
Leonid Ostaltsev, the founder of Ukrainian veteran-run Pizza Veterano restaurant in Kiev, knows Reefmaster personally and couldn't think of a single negative thing to say.
He was a guest at my pizzeria. We met there. I can't say anything else. He was a normal guy. He wrote songs. I listened to his songs on the radio. To say anything else, well, from the negative side, I don't know anything.
Another war veteran, Yulia Payevska, also commented on the situation prior to the briefing held by Interior Minister Arsen Avakov on the Sheremet case.
We first need to see some evidence for the guilty parties. He was a soldier, he helped in the war zone, and it's hard to understand. I have no comments because all this still hasn't quite sunk in.
At the briefing, Interior Minister Avakov stated that there are 5 suspects in total: Antonenko, Kuzmenko, Dugard, as well as a couple, Inna and Vladislav Hryshchenko, who are also war veterans who served under the alliance of Puma and Bucha. However, the involvement of the Hryshchenko couple has now been downgraded to simply people of interest due to what Interior Ministry representative Artem Shevchenko says is the Hryshchenko's ability to, quote, provide information about the Sheremet case. The second suspect, Yulia Kuzmenko, is a military medic and volunteer, and a doctor in civilian life. She works at Ohmad-Dyd, a children's hospital in Kiev, in cardiology and heart surgery. Both suspects are well acquainted with one another. Photographs from the social media accounts of Reefmaster and Kuzmenko show that Kuzmenko attended a concert at a pub held by Reefmaster the next day following the Sheremet's murder. The last suspect, Yana Duhar, is a nurse serving in the 25th Paratrooper Battalion of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. She's accused of acting as surveillance for Sheremet's murder following his movements close to the scene of the crime. Prosecutors say that she took photographs of local CCTV cameras in the area. Meanwhile, the Hryshchenko couple, despite now being considered as only persons of interest, were accused at the briefing of procuring the murder weapon, the car bomb that ended Pavel Sheremet's life. Investigators say that Inna Hryshchenko's DNA was found on another similar bomb during an investigation into a different murder the Hryshchenkos are accused of, and that Vladislav himself is an expert in explosive devices. However, the information provided by the Ukrainian government about the case and the suspects, whose motive, according to Avakov, was the, quote, destabilization of the government, leaves more questions than answers. A 2017 joint investigation by investigative journalism outlets OCCRP and Slidstvo.Info established that an Ukrainian security service employee, Igor Ustimenko, was also present at the scene of the crime when the suspects are alleged to have planted the car bomb. Ustimenko's involvement in the case has not been mentioned by any of the Ukrainian officials who've made public statements about the case. During Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy's press marathon in October, he alluded to the fact that there may be resignations in the Interior Ministry if the Sheremet case remains unresolved.
Coming back to what Tetiana Popova said here, my question is, how detrimental to the image of Ukraine and to the peace process is the current development?
Of course, any development in investigation of such crime is good for, from my point of view, for image of Ukraine. It's a question how they made it. If they should made it a bit later when they have suspects who orders that, that's from my point of view will be better. From another point of view, all these suspects, some of them already involved in another case of bombing with such kind of bomb in another city of Ukraine, but some of them with all this voice audio conversation, I was really very afraid of some of their words when they start speaking about further destabilization, and they spoke that we need to have a psychologist, regisseur, and sacral victim. It was really, it looks very close to what usually Russians called when they organize information psychological operations. So from my point of view, it looks really very dangerous and too professional for children cardiologists.
Elena, how detrimental this is for the feeling of security or insecurity among Ukrainian journalists? We know, and Tetiana mentioned that, for instance, there was a pressure on Slidstvo.Info, plus, of course, we know about threats and beatings and all this kind of stuff. How important it is for us, journalists, that Pavel Sheremet's case is investigated in earnest.
Of course, I think among all of us, among colleagues, before Gongadze case, Sheremet case will not be solved, nobody can feel secure. That's why we need to be together and continue these cases, not forget them, because it's about all of us. and this need to be done really carefully. I'm really had a bad feeling that, like Sheremet mom said, that unguilty people can be hurt. It's about people's lives. You need to have very iron proofs to say that somebody is guilty in murder. It's sometimes different when you make stories about just corruption, or if you say that somebody is guilty in killing. You need to be very careful.
Thank you very much, Elena Loginova, Tetiana Popova, and we will be closely watching the next developments in the Sheremet case, of course, and you should go to the Sunday show to get more and more information. All this is happening against the background of further discussion of what the sides were able to achieve or not able to achieve at the Paris summit of the Normandy Four. Ukraine, Russia, France, Germany signed some new documents, and we already hear accusations from Russia that Ukraine tried to alter the documents which were previously agreed. Hromadske went to Alexei Reznikov, who is Ukraine's representative in the political subgroup of the Trilateral Contact Group, and asked them what is the news in the political settlement of the conflict.
There should be a political agreement based on principles, as in, yes, we agree that there's a logic that demands amendments to the Minsk Agreements in order to make them work. And then it all descends onto the Trilateral Contact Group in Minsk, where we work as editors. And again, after running this through political advisors or the foreign ministers of the four countries, a decision will be made and those changes will be implemented. The main thing is to have that side really want to make an armistice. So we have a long way of negotiating, explaining, and demonstrating to them the research is done by experts and international institutions that state that there can be no political regulation of a war without resolving security questions as a prerequisite. For example, the wonderful experts at the Ukrainian Institute of International Politics made some research in the year 2016 where they looked at the most recent events, starting from the conflict in Northern Ireland, in the former states of Yugoslavia, and in some African countries. They made this quite illustrative presentation. We spoke with them prior to our Paris trip, which clearly stated that in those events where there was a war, a conflict, if there was no control over the border, then armed military resistance would spark once more. And those countries that first had the return of the control over the border, disarmament, demilitarization, reintegration of combatants, the amnesty laws and laws on upcoming elections and how will they be held, published in advance, and then the right time was awaited for society to understand, and then elections held, and only then were there no continuation of the conflict. We will definitely write down our own proposals for amending the Minsk Agreements. The President even had them ready in his initiatives. But in those 4 months, our expectations that even the homework that the sides had agreed upon pertaining to the upcoming prisoner exchange, the disengagement of forces in 3 agreed-upon places, these are things that can be done before the end of March in order for this chemistry of a complex conflict where for 3 years nothing has been happening. Minsk and everything else were virtually frozen. This chemistry of restarting talks and dialogue, it must start working. When the Kremlin decides what they want to do with Ukraine next, because you and I don't know their plans, then their stance for the nearest future will be clear. If they are ready to have an armistice, to withdraw their forces, which they say are not there, from Ukraine, then we will move forward respectively.
Almost a week after the so-called Normandy summit, or actually the Paris summit and the Normandy format, we're still asking questions. And we have some distinguished panelists now in the studio of the Sunday show to probably answer some of the questions, but maybe ask their own questions. And these are Sviatoslav Yurash, who is a member of the parliament, Sluga Narodu, the servant of the people faction, Maria Zolkina, she is a political analyst of the Democratic Initiatives Foundation, and Mykola Kapitonenko, member of the expert board of the Parliamentary Foreign Policy Committee. So, before I start to ask questions of you, are there any questions for you that remain unanswered? And we'll probably start with a member of the parliament.
Obviously, there are many questions to be confronted, as the fundamental question of reaching peace is not decided yet. We can achieve that, hopefully, after Berlin. But again, many signs point us that this was a positive step in which we have managed to achieve the exchange of prisoners, the full one. And what makes me hopeful that that will be achieved in the end is the fact that we have exchanged some prisoners already, or experience doing that with this administration. Second, we have expanded the OSCE mandate for them to monitor everything at night as well as during the day, which will allow us to lessen the instances which are getting Ukrainian soldiers killed in the east. And fundamentally...
When will this policy start to be implemented?
That's a good
because
question.
Even today we have a casualty in the east.
Exactly, but the point is that the expansion mandate isn't done right away. Obviously, it's a policy the OSCE as an organization must implement gradually, but the point is this expansion mandate will give us more of a hope and a clear path towards actual ceasefire in the east.
Thank you,
And
Mr.
thirdly
Yurash.
is if I may, the follow-up summit in Berlin, which again gives me hope that at that we'll get a clear timeline of Russian withdrawal and an actual elections there, which will give us peace.
All right, but of course there are still many more questions about the elections themselves. Maria Zolkina, what's your unanswered question?
Unanswered question for me is mainly what are the guarantees for fulfilling all those security provisions of the Minsk Agreements, which were one more time considered or proved to be the preconditions for any talks, any discussion on electoral issues. And that is why the next question is whether the next Normandy summit will take place, actually. At all, because I don't see now any concrete prospects for Russia to withdraw its forces out of occupied part of the Donbas and to proceed with the issue of disarmament or regaining or returning the control over the border to Ukraine. And that is why, taking all this into account, I don't see any real preconditions to have the new summit where Putin will have to show some symmetric steps, because Ukraine have already done the steps in the form of a prolongation of so-called specific status for the Donbas, and will continue to discuss within the Minsk trilateral contact group the withdrawal of or pullback of the army and the forces along the contact line. But what will Russia demonstrate on the next or up to the next Normandy summit? This is the question without an answer, and that is why I don't know whether the next summit is needed for Moscow.
Mykola Kapitonenko, as an insider to the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Parliament, what is your unanswered question?
Not so much as an insider, but as a political scientist, let's say, who is specializing on conflict issues, the fundamental question for me...
Aren't you an expert of the Foreign Affairs Committee?
I am, but this is the
issue... You're not allowed inside.
Not so much, but this is the issue for a political scientist rather than an advisor to parliamentary committee. And from the very beginning, for me, the most fundamental issue was the question of price. What kind of price Ukraine is ready to pay for either resolving or freezing the conflict, settling the conflict. When we are talking about peace, we mean the price we have to pay. And in my view, this is the fundamental issue. And it becomes even more fundamental when we get to more specific issues, like the issue of the sequence of steps in holding elections and getting back control over the border. This is something we will have to answer in upcoming months, because if Russia allows the change in sequence of steps, and if it withdraws the troops before having elections, we will have also to pay something for this. And in my view, this issue remains unanswered, and there is no clear consensus within Ukrainian society, and there is no clear political vision of how we see the dynamics of the conflict resolution.
The word that my interlocutors used most of all is step, starting from Mr. Yurash through Ms. Zolkina and to Mykola Kapitonenko. Before I go to the Skype connection with Natalia Humaniuk, who is now in Moscow, very briefly, what is the next step if the Berlin does not happen? Maria Zolkina.
The freezing of the conflict, actually, and the freezing of negotiation process.
Yes, Mr. Kapitonenko.
I don't think that Russians will accept such a low price for settling the conflict. So we will have the continuation of a low-intensity military.
All right, Mr. Yurash.
The national regime of pressure and sanctions will continue and even possibly strengthen because Russia has shown inability and unwillingness to actually settle this conflict.
And we now have Natalia Humaniuk of Hromadske in Moscow on Skype with us. Natalia, what's the attitude in Moscow? How actively are they discussing the results or preliminary results and the next steps in this direction?
So good evening. Yeah, I've spent this week trying to figure out and to know the more reaction both from Paris, Berlin, and finally official Moscow on the insights of the Paris meeting. Of course, there is very little we can trust if we speak about the official Russian sources. However, talking to the independent journalists and analysts who have some sources in the Kremlin, from this side, what we probably should to know, that first of all, of course, there are those two different groups in the Kremlin, which is the one close to the president, assistant to the president Putin, Vladislav Surkov, dealing with the political part. He had been in Minsk, and as well Dmytro Kozak, who is dealing with all the economical things, but who deals also with money. This is the deputy prime minister responsible for the Donbas in the Russian government. They are in the quarrel themselves. They have different views. We know that the Surkov's more or less part was quite disappointed in a different way with the forum. First of all, what we understand that this group was rather disappointed that they haven't managed to trick the new Ukrainian president. They hoped that it would be easier to play with him. There are talks that there was a preliminary, at least Surkov claimed that there was some preliminary agreement over the full, bigger, more points for the withdrawal. But in general, there is the risk since the since there was no way to, trickle, there was no way to do something, big, that there could be this very long process of negotiation as it was before. However, we should say that still, this meeting in Minsk had been seen, meeting in Paris had been seen as a movement, though these were the small steps, because the fact that the next Normandy meeting will take place without the conditions, and I personally heard how the Russian president said that he would come, still means that there is this time for months that the sides would show whether they can trust each other. In this impossible, distrust which had been created within the years, it's still something. We also talked to the, the members of the Ukrainian delegation, and they somehow let known that that was the general mantra of Vladimir Putin was always that, like, I didn't trust the previous government. I didn't trust the previous government. You need to give me more time in order to show that you can be trusted, that you fulfill. We understand who is aggressor in this side, but that was the communication. So it's not seen as the as something which was fully successful, but it still is not seen as a stalemate. I think that's something important to mention. I probably would like to add, else you didn't ask, but I also try to talk quite a lot to people in the from the French president administration and from the Frau Merkel circle, from the Berlin. Generally, what I know that they were positively surprised by the Ukrainian side. There are two important things: that the sanctions were never touched. There was no any will from the Western partners to discuss that. Also, it was very important, especially for Paris, to show that Zelensky was not one against three, vice versa. It was like there were three of them against Vladimir Putin, and. Also, the fact that both Elysee and both with the Berlin more or less agreed that there is a legitimacy of the Ukrainian claim that something should be sorted out with Minsk agreement regarding the border control. So if before there was always the denial, full denial from the Ukrainian side, quite legitimate, but however in Minsk we know there should be the border control. There is no discussion about the border control prior to the elections. However, that was more or less like the discussion which led to nowhere. Now we hear some of the backing that this word, like there is a foundation for this claim of Zelensky that this could be renegotiated. That is there, that is taken serious, which is, not the sign of the victory, but still something in order to pursue.
Thank you very much, Natalia Gumniuk in Moscow. And we go back to the studio where we have three distinguished panelists to discuss what Natalia has said. But also another question is, Mykola Kapitonenko and other spokespersons mentioned here it's either resolution or freezing. And I say, some people would say freezing is the resolution. What would you say?
Again, from a theoretical point of view, you may either freeze the conflict with no territories returned under Ukrainian control, just shellings would stop and people would stop dying. That is the freezing, settlement of the conflict, the situation like we used to have in Transnistria, for example. And there is a resolution when specific disputes have been resolved and the territories are back under Ukrainian control, and then we can speak about post-conflict regulations and reintegration, something we are speaking about very much, but something which is unattainable before Russian forces are out.
Mr. Yurash.
It's very clear that as far as the settlement that is demanded by 3 million Ukrainians in Donbass and demanded by 1.5 million Ukrainians that have been IDPs from Donbass. And it's very clear that that is demanded by Ukrainian society as a whole, basically. The demand for peace is there, and we need to deliver on it. And just freezing conflict isn't enough for that prospect. We need to deliver actual results. And as a member of Foreign Affairs Committee, what I can tell you is that there are many talks about possible steps to take with Russia to get that done.
Maria Zolkina. Freezing against resolution.
First of all, I think this conflict has already some features of protracted conflict. Already, this is not something which can be settled and which can be solved in a very short-term perspective. It has already not happened. But at the same time, the full freezing of the conflict will not be possible if Russia doesn't want that as well. The only thing that Ukraine can freeze, actually, is to freeze the negotiations, which was done, actually, by the previous president. And I think that the main risk arising now in diplomatic area for Volodymyr Zelenskyy with his will to move forward with negotiations with Russia is that he might appear in some political deadlock again when any other movement forward on this negotiation path will be linked to some concessions and painful for Ukrainian society and Ukrainian side issues like the border, which was not agreed, the border issue in this Normandy meeting, but it doesn't mean that now, in between the previous one and the next one, Normandy summit, it will not be agreed in some maybe even informal channels between Moscow and Kyiv. And here, if Ukraine, for instance, doesn't want to agree with Russia's idea to return the control over the border after elections or on the day of elections, for instance, or I don't know, a couple of days before the elections, which will mean that all the electoral campaign will be without full control of this territory on the side of Ukrainian state. If Ukraine doesn't agree with that, it will mean that there is no space for further negotiations with Russia, and we will have to freeze, actually, in fact, the negotiation process and to start develop all those domestic public policy, all that domestic public policy towards occupied territories, which was not done and developed normal on needed level by the previous government and previous presidential administration.
How important in this respect is the role of civil society? How closely should the governing bodies listen to people mentioned by Sviatoslav Yurash, for instance, the 1.5 million IDPs or those people who live on the occupied territories? Is there, and which are the ways to make their voices heard by the government?
So one of the issues to make those voices heard is the idea of Vladimir Zelenskyy to change the representation of Ukrainian side in the Minsk trilateral contact group. I hardly believe it will be possible because Minsk trilateral contact group is a specific format, and it's a good idea to have people who have some professional and personal links to Donbas, but I don't know whether it will be implemented successfully. But at the same time, I think we can speak not as much about civil society, but mainly about general public opinion, which of course influence the negotiation position. Because if there was no such a high level of resistance to, for instance, amendments to constitution or to specific status of the Donbas or to elections on Russia's conditions, there would be, in Ukrainian society, there would be much more readiness maybe on the side of our diplomats to speak with Russia on these issues and to agree to Russia's scenarios. But Ukrainian society demonstrated over this period of Vladimir Zelenskyy presidency that the level of readiness to accept some painful compromises didn't get lower. It actually became even higher to some extent in some regions.
Thank you, Maria. Which is the most painful compromise among those that Ms. Zolkina alludes to?
Well, Mrs. Zelenskyy has clearly outlined time and time again red lines which weren't crossed, weren't even approached in Paris, and that's a clear indication we will continue fulfilling our promises. In the studio, I told you that the fundamental and acceptable compromise is the territory, something of an exchange of territory, something given up by Ukraine, and that's unacceptable by the president as well as his government and members of parliament. So you will clearly have a walk with Russia in that context, those unacceptable red lines which will not be crossed, no matter what Russia poses on the table.
But still, are there painful compromises?
Painful compromises have to deal with the fact what we renewed in the parliament just now, which is special status Donbas. That essentially is a tricky idea. Special status doesn't actually mean that much. We need to fill it with content which will provide some sort of a transitional period for the reintegration of Donbas, which has a lot of work that needs to be done for it to be a part of Ukraine again.
Is it part of the draft law that the president submitted recently as far as changes to the constitution are concerned?
As well as you know, there's no text at the moment, and as soon as it will be available, both for us and for you, we'll be discussing it ad nauseum. But it's very clear that the discussion isn't happening.
I thought that you, as one of the influential persons in the president's inner circle, might know.
That's a very strong statement, but the reality of it, it's the point of negotiations which happened in Berlin, and to see exactly what what Russians are demanding for their occupation, to leave their occupation of the east.
All right, Mr. Kapitonenko, thinking of all the areas and conflicts that Russia unleashed on its neighboring states, I can hardly believe one that's been resolved. They are all frozen. Is there any hope at all, or are we just being played by Russians?
They are frozen because Russia demands very much for resolving them, and they play an important instrumental role in geopolitical environment. So when Russia lacks other instruments of influence, it bets on frozen conflicts. Usually, statistically, they last for 25 plus years. That's why we should better be prepared for a very long conflict settlement process.
What are the next unexpected initiatives that may come or should come from the Ukrainian side, Mr. Kapitonenko?
In my view, we will have the most difficult issue now is in dealing with elections in occupied territories and return of control over the border. If we presume that there is something we can do for Russians to agree to withdraw troops before holding elections, that should be our initiative. For instance, having talks with the so-called DNR, LNR leaders, direct talks, in exchange, or given Russia additional guarantees that Ukraine would fulfill all the commitments under Minsk Agreements in exchange for withdrawal of troops before the elections. We should invent something to make Russians leave before the elections.
Mr. Yurash?
Unacceptable, because the NRL creations of Russian occupation, clearly and very visibly so. For us, it's a matter of talking in Berlin and can talk with the source of all the troubles we have, Mr. Putin. And we'll see how productive it is, but there are plans B and plans C on the table, which have been voiced by the foreign minister already, and there are steps that we are thinking to take if the diplomatic paths aren't as fruitful as they can be.
What is under the table?
Many things which better not be discussed before the Berlin talks happen.
Right, Maria Zolkina.
Adding to some proposals on the deal with Russia in order to have its troops to be withdrawn from the occupied territories, I would say that it would be beneficial for Ukraine to talk about all the period before the elections, not only from political point of view, but mainly from technical point of view. How other Ukrainian central bodies, for instance, will be restored in force on the occupied territories, because elections are only about local councils and mayors, for instance, or perfect if it is about if it is on the basis of decentralization reform, as it is in the other parts of Ukraine, for instance. But anyway, elections will be mainly about technical possibility of Ukrainian different official bodies to be restored and to function in a full-fledged form on the occupied territories before the elections. And another way is to set or to propose some concrete terms and steps to have guarantees how that withdrawal of forces and disarmament will be made, because as of now we have no one to verify and to control and to organize that process. OSCE, even with some broader mandate, will not be possible to do it, as it is not possible to control the ceasefire, for instance, now.
Are we back to contemplating the UN involvement in this case?
I think that it is not an accidental idea that arose in this autumn from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that we might return to the idea of some kind of international mission, because we denied, from I think diplomatic point of view, and on the basis of Zelensky's will to have a quick result, we denied this idea. But we really might return to this idea, because we have to find some instruments, some mechanism to have the withdrawal of forces organized and some transitional period on those territories before full reintegration conducted or controlled, actually.
Thank you, Ms. Zolkina. Mr. Kapitonenko, about the UN or possible other international involvement apart from the OSCE.
I'm sure that at some point we will have to face this option, and certainly UN is a better option than the OSCE. It has all necessary experience and resources to have this mission accomplished. There are lots of technical issues, very difficult ones, starting from, for instance, should IDPs vote in local elections, and ending up with what to do with 60,000+ armed troops which are located in the occupied territories, how they should be disarmed and what they should do after the conflict. These are the issues to be addressed by an international administration, and we should get back to that idea, but certainly before political tensions between Ukraine and Russia are resolved.
Mr. Yurash,
there are many ways to handle this sort of issue. We already have various countries approaching us with offers of help from their experience. Some of them want
What do they want in exchange?
Well, many of them are essentially very eager to share their experience and success cases, basically, for integration of various conflict regions. And unfortunately, from my studies in international relations, UN involvement doesn't usually resolve the situation. It only prolongs the frozenness of the conflict. So I'm more keen to have a solution that's coming from Ukraine, implemented by Ukraine.
Different opinions, different but deep experience of our participants tonight. Thank you very much, Mr. Yurash, Ms. Zolkina, Mr. Kapitonenko. Continue to watch this Sunday show. We will keep our eyes closed on the developments. And this is a good spot to mention that Hromadske International is celebrating, or at least marking the 5th anniversary, and you of course can support us with your generous donations, letters of recognition, and all this kind of stuff. And I was told that there's going to be something shown after these awards. No? Okay. Tam.
I would like us to be heard, not only in Ukraine, but all over the world.
No bread for 3 months.
Not one, but look how many. There's bread here and there.
You are going against the God.
Of course, point number 1. Thanks for the invitation.
When will this all end? The number of political prisoners has grown.
Good evening from our headquarters in Kyiv.